As we grow up, our parents ingrain certain things in our mind, certain things that they feel are important. And so they tell us to remember those things. When I was growing up, there was a family that lived next door to our house. And they were there from the time I was born until the time I was about 7 or 8. And they had a little boy, and his name was Scott. So as a little kid, I was able to see that boy grow up from a baby. And when he got to be 3 or 4 years old, he'd come over to our house. And whenever he would walk through the kitchen, he would point to the stove and he would say, hot, hot. And so anytime we would talk about that little boy, we would say, hot, hot. And I think he was 5 years old. And still, the one word that he knew was hot. Because I'm sure that his parents impressed upon him how important it is not to put your hands on hot things when you go into the kitchen. And he knew every item in the house that could potentially be hot. That's the same thing with Micah 6:8. Great passage today. I think that everyone who is a person of faith ought to know Micah 6:8. It's right up there with what would Jesus do? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? So who was Micah? He lived in the 8th century. He was a prophet. Remember, prophets weren't fortune tellers. They didn't tell the future. They were truth tellers. They told the truth about the world that they lived in. Micah is an exception to the rule of many of the authors of the Old Testament books because he was probably a farm worker. He came from a small village in the north. And he was a prophet who looked around and he saw what was happening to his fellow farmers and fellow landowners, and how the powerful landlords would continue to squeeze them year after year. Things got worse, and their mortgage would get deeper, and their taxes would get higher. And eventually his friends were losing their farms, and we've all seen that through the history of our communities. We go through a time of difficult economic times, and we want to speak out. And so Micah spoke out against the people who lived in the big cities, the people who were caught up in personal comfort, in luxuries, in prosperity, and in security. Micah reminds me of someone who was in the news this last week, Pete Seeger. Think about Micah as Pete Seeger. He's the guy that sings songs like One of These Days. One of these days. He had a quote, participation. That's what's going to save the human race. Participation. And so the prophet Micah, when he's in this state, exalted state, when he's speaking to God, what is required of us? It's to realize that we're all connected. And what happens in one place affects people in another. To accept responsibility. To know that each one of us have gifts that God has given us to be used for a purpose in the world. To be used for others. To be used to bring people up. And one of the basic teachings of our faith seems to be totally out of touch with the values of our modern culture. Walk humbly. How many of us could pick out a famous person in our world today and we could say that person's motto is to walk humbly? Maybe there are a few. We're going to learn a little Hebrew this morning. The word to do justice is the word mishpat. The word for loving kindness, as a matter of fact, that's how the word loving kindness got into English language. Because of the Hebrew word hesed, which means loving kindness. And the word hesneah, which means to walk humbly with your God. These are the things, Micah says, he learned that God requires of us. He begins by saying, "O mortal." And we know about those mortals. We know about the unhealthy competition with their brothers. As I was thinking about Micah's heritage and his history and his religion, think about the stories that he would have known, stories that people would have told him. It was all about how we treat brothers. The very first brothers, Cain and Abel, had their own resentments, had their own competition for their father's favor. Jacob and Esau, instead of cooperating and enjoying the blessings of the land, struggled with one another over who would inherit it, over who owned it. Joseph and his brothers. Joseph is the envy of his brothers because they feel that his father loves him more than the others. The disciples of Jesus argued over who was the greatest among them. And the Bible is this retelling of different stories so that we can look at life as it is. And of all things, we ought to be people that are about liberation. To help to liberate people from their fears and from their anxieties. And as we look out at the world today, we see a lot of fearful people. We see a lot of people that have deep anxieties. Some people are resentful because they didn't get the recognition that they felt they deserved. And they need to be liberated from hanging on to that. If we look around at the world today, we wonder why things are falling apart, why violence is so prevalent in our society today. We wonder every time we hear of a shooting in some unknown place, people that are completely disconnected. And we have to be truth tellers and wonder what's going on that these things are happening among us. We have to ask the same question that Micah asked. What is required of us? Now, I could give you a historical analysis of Christian ethics through the years. And I would say that sometimes the Christian church has really gotten it wrong. And we've really been off base sometimes. Because sometimes what is required of people is simply what you believe. Some little statement, some series of words that you have to say in a certain way. Those of you who grew up with catechism know what I mean. What is required of you? To memorize the catechism, right? That's what confirmation is about. It's what you believe. Now, there are other people who say, what does God require of you? Well, God requires that every single little thing in the sanctuary has to be in place. That's what God requires. And that we can't dip people in the water. We have to sprinkle them with water on their head. And God forbid if we did something wrong in the liturgy of a communion service, because we know how God is and how angry God gets when we mess up. That's what Mike is talking about in this passage. The faith isn't about the trappings. Faith is about connections and responsibilities in the social and economic world. God doesn't care one bit how the curtains are hung, where the coffee hour is, the color of paint on the wall, how someone is dunked during baptism. All those things are not the things that God requires. It'd be nice if it was, and that'd be easy. We could do that. But God requires justice and kindness. And from Micah to Pete Seeger, we've had people on the outside who know the truth. And they say, something's wrong. We're majoring in minors. And we have to be caught up in a compelling vision of the world that God gives to us, and that's our mission. And that's the only thing that matters, to bring justice and righteousness in our life. And all the things that we tend to get uptight about are not the things that God thinks are necessary. Maybe the best word in this whole Micah 6:8 is a little two-letter word, the word visioning toward the end of the meeting. We kind of ran out of time to talk around tables and do some visioning. But we had this concept that one of our vision team members had, and they said it's a philosophy of one more. And what does the philosophy of one more mean? It means if you're reading a book, you do one more chapter. If you're trying to get in shape, you do one more lap. Or you do one more repetition with the weights. Maybe you're trying a certain spiritual discipline, and it means I'm going to try it one more day. Or I'm going to continue to be about this study one more hour. And what was it that Jesus talked about with the second mile? I always am confused when I meet someone new and they ask me the question, well, what do you do? And I have to think about it because it depends. Depends on what's happening that week. Depends on the people that God sends in my path. Depends on the people you interact with. It depends on your connections. It depends on your responsibilities. It depends on your gifts. So I think, the next time somebody asks me, what do you do? I'm going to quote Micah 6:8. Try to do justice, and try to love kindness, and I try to walk humbly with God. You can try that. The Bible says you ought to be doers of the word and not merely hearers. Do is the most important word in this passage. Good words are spoken. Good worship happens. But it's what you do that matters. What do you do? How do you contribute to this kind of economic justice that Mike was talking about? Some people become payees for those who cannot control their own money. And I encourage you to do that if you can. Because it's a very good way to learn what it's like to manage a budget of $700 a month and have food and shelter. It's a good way to understand the problems of poverty. And we need to have that connection with people who are in poverty. So perhaps, even if you're not a payee, maybe you can stick with someone. Maybe you can adopt a family until you are able to help them to resolve their problem. To encourage their children to stay in school, to get an education. To find out when they're having trouble with transportation issues or when they need food. You can do that. You have neighbors. You could adopt a family. There are some people in our congregation that are very generous, and they regularly contribute to our breakfast program. And without those people, those anonymous people, those silent people in our pews today, our breakfast program wouldn't happen. And we wouldn't provide a release from anxiety that people in Worcester have about not having enough to eat because they can always find a place. Maybe you can help somebody work on their GED or to speak up for them to find a job when they have no one else they can turn to be a reference. Jesus said the best good that you can ever do is to approach someone who can never repay you. And I believe those words, and I believe that's doing justice, and that's being humble. Now, we live in a world where more people than usual will be praying this Sunday. And they'll be praying for a slight edge on the kickoff, and that the wide receiver catches the last Hail Mary pass of the game. You know, because we've all been there. Of course, we were with the Browns, so. Well, I don't know what's wrong. We haven't prayed hard enough. See, that's our philosophy. That's so terrible that bad things happen in our world and there's no equality. But we know human